Lauren DesRosiers, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Let's start. You see what's been going on in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Three shootings, two people have been killed in the last month, and this is all part of immigration enforcement. As someone that lives in this immigration world on the legal side of things, what have you seen, and what is your thought on how this is being conducted at this point?
I think it's really concerning. I think that the murder of two people in Minnesota regarding in conflict with ICE who had no weapons, who were simply observers, and who had the shootings well documented. Um, to to see that happen and to kind of see the almost cover up of what happened has been really troubling, with the federal government not willing to disclose evidence to local law enforcement to investigate the crimes, or potential crimes, and a real twisting of what is actually visible on both of the videos. But I think that this points to a broader problem with kind of um, widespread beliefs in within ICE, kind of widespread practices and beliefs in ICE of impunity. And I think that this is a pretty common attitude that has been a longstanding issue within many DHS agencies, including CBP as well as ICE. I do think that the move to move Tom Homan, who is a border czar, an advisor from the Trump White House into Minnesota, is a concerning development, simply because he actually has no authority over ICE. He's attaché. He's a liaison. It's not a czar is not authority, and it's not an appointed position within the agency. And so the fact that there is a direct White House connection that is overseeing or is supposedly overseeing some of the operations is a concerning development.
Do you know the parameters in which an individual who signs up to do this enforcement has to fulfill? Is it the same as other law enforcement?
They have specified training. I'm not familiar with the specifics of the training, but there are basic training procedures that they're required to do under the statute and regulation before they are permitted um, to act as immigration agents.
Yeah, because I think there were some questions about what protocol was in the situation from this weekend, and I think there was differing views on that. I believe I saw a former acting ICE director on Fox News saying they did what they were supposed to do in the situation. So I think that's one of the big questions as to what is the procedure, the communication like when it comes to an interaction like that.
That is outside the scope of what I am an expert on, but I think that I do think that uh, any agency that says its procedure to shoot somebody after they have been disarmed and who didn't have any weapon in their hand, and very clearly was not a threat, um, is concerning in and of itself.
What have you heard about this dynamic of these alerts, right? And we've seen them in the capital region as well, where people will see some vehicles, personnel, sort of mobilizing in a neighborhood. What is the dynamic there, and does it have an impact? I mean, is it helping individuals? What's going on there?
I think that there are two different kind of ways that these reporting and rapid response networks can work. One is the more informal version where it's not checked, it's not verified, and somebody posts on social media, "Oh, I saw ICE here," and it creates a panic. And that I think is something that I haven't seen a lot during this administration, but I have seen in the past. And I think what's been happening in the capital region has been really well organized. And I do think it's helpful. I think that it provides accountability. And I think that it opens the door and opens a window into seeing what is actually happening, because I think a lot of what is happening right now is everyday Americans who aren't familiar with immigration and how these law enforcement, immigration enforcement operations work, seeing in the inside of how these agencies do operate. And so I think that the Capital Region Sanctuary Coalition, Columbia County Sanctuary Movement, and other rapid response networks have been really instrumental in opening that window.
Is it, where does it get to a point, if you can speak to this, of crossing a line that some are saying of impeding an investigation, impeding law enforcement, which then they will argue justifies taking, force and an action in response?
Um, I I think I'm not familiar with the specifics of the case law on the impeding part, but are, there are laws that prohibit like assault on an officer, right? And so like physically interfering with an arrest is never a good idea. Um, it ends up escalating the chance of physical violence, the chance of lethality, and it creates a more dangerous situation, not just for the person who is being arrested, but also for the people who are the observers. And I think that we've seen that. I don't want to. I want to make sure that I'm not victim blaming here, because I think that the people who have the responsibility to make sure that they de-escalate situations are going to be the people who are trained, who have weapons, and who are quote unquote deployed to municipality.
Let's get to the whole concept of a municipality working with ICE and communicating, and that you heard some of that from the administration after what happened, as they're saying, well, if the Democratic governor and the mayor would have just opened their doors and worked with ICE, then this wouldn't have escalated and it wouldn't be this tense right now. We see 287G agreements in New York State in different counties, Nassau, Rensselaer, Madison, just a few. Why would a municipality not want to work with ICE?
Um, so there are 287G agreements that are agreements between local law enforcement entities and the federal government with ICE for cooperating and acting in some capacities as civil immigration enforcement agents. And I think we've talked in the past about why that in and of itself is a problem. But there are a few different reasons that municipalities, that localities wouldn't want to be associated with ICE, I think particularly in this moment. First of all, like local law enforcement has a very different and distinct role from federal immigration enforcement. Regardless of like the criminal and civil division, local law enforcement is focused on local laws. They're trained regarding local laws. They know what local laws are, and they're paid to do that. And that's the scope of which in their scope of their authorization. If you have an agency, a police agency, that is both responsible for taking in domestic violence calls and potential domestic violence cases, or robbery cases, or other cases where witnesses or the victim could be undocumented or could have some sort of indeterminate immigration status, then if they are also coordinating and cooperating with ICE, people aren't going to come forward. People aren't going to be willing to disclose information. They're going to be scared of the local police force, and they're not going to be cooperative. When there is limited interaction between the local police agency and ICE, people are much more willing to come forward, especially if that's well known. So Albany, for instance, it's much easier for people to come forward because they know that they aren't going to be targeted, and they aren't going to have their information necessarily handed over to ICE if they report a crime.
And then you saw over in Buffalo, was it today, I think, the new mayor over there banned the municipality from corresponding and working. Is that enforced? How do you enforce that?
I think that gets enforced
Locally,
through
like,
the
yeah.
local level. There are a couple kind of similar state bills that have been introduced for the past couple years and that will be up again. Dignity not detention prohibits state and local law enforcement from contracting. So it's kind of like that on a statewide scale. And then New York for All is another bill that limits information sharing.
Hmm. We've heard this, the fact that ICE was created in 2003, and it's been around for what, 23 years now. I think this goes back to what you said earlier with the individuals that are going out with alerts and things like that and responding to that. How has it changed, the enforcement since 2003? Has it changed, or has this been the way it's kind of always been, and now we're just seeing it because there's so many more people with cameras?
I think I think that to a certain extent um, there are, there's a documented history um, of certain cultures within different agencies. And I think that there is a culture of impunity that has been reported for decades now within some of these immigration DHS agencies, ICE and CBP, particularly Border Patrol, which is within CBP. Um, However, things are very different right now. So there was a steady increase in the ICE budget from its inception up until last year, and it kind of like slowly climbed up to about 10 billion. It is now, after this past summer and the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, um, it's now over $80 billion. And the current funding that is before the Senate right now at issue is, one of the things at issue is whether ICE should get, I think it's 10 or $20 billion more. So there's been this astronomical, like 8 to 10 times increase in the amount of money that is going to ICE now. And I think the discretion that is now given to the kind of like frontline agents, the lack of training, I think the lack of review of many of the new agents. There's been a number of reports of the lack of investigation into people's backgrounds before they're hired. That is all new within the past year, including changes in ICE policy that like are significant breaks with past practice in the way that the agency has interpreted the law in the past. So for instance, mandatory detention is now being applied to anybody who entered without inspection. That is a real break from how the agency has interpreted the law previously. So there is some consistency, and I think the worst parts of those cultures that have developed over decades are kind of coming to the fore and exacerbating.
Some have called to abolish ICE. What would that mean? In terms of immigration enforcement?
I think that can mean many things depending on who is saying it. Um, I I think that there are a number of arguments for why immigration, as it's currently regulated, as it's currently practiced, as it's currently implemented in the United States, is very clearly not working. And I think what ICE has turned into is not, it is not a kind of mundane police force. It is a police force that has wide impunity. It's very difficult to prosecute any wrongdoers. It's very difficult to actually hold police accountable because immigration falls into this odd little bucket between criminal law and every other type of law, and it's civil in nature. People who are caught up in that system don't get the protections that you do in criminal law. And so it ends up creating this weird little bucket where there's a lot of where there's few ways to rectify wrongdoing to people who are in the system. And so that I think that that's a very dangerous place to be. And so I think calls to abolish ICE are better understood or can be understood in some ways as calls to really transform and do away with the immigration system as it's currently implemented in the US today.
Yeah, I guess my next question would be like if you abolish ICE and you've used Border Patrol in examples here too, what does Border Patrol just kind of take over that role?
I think that is, I think that that's why I think you have to redo the system, because if you abolish ICE and you don't abolish CBP or Border Patrol or USCIS enforcement agents, then it just transforms into something else. And I think that the only way to prevent that from happening is to do a wholesale revision.
Do you think you talk about the funding, right? You said from 10 to 80 billion in the Big Beautiful Bill Act. Say 80 billion was, you talk about reform, this is hypothetical, just redoing immigration. Say you put 80 billion into judges, courts, attorneys, and do you think that could accomplish this goal of finding the so-called worst of the worst before they make an impact on the community? A different way to go at it?
Um, I think that the call to get rid of the worst of the worst is kind of a red herring. I don't know if I think that when certain people get demonized and there's the idea that you're going to go after a certain number of people with a specific type of profile, a specific type of background, it's very easy to slip from that into everybody else, right? So it's like the bad hombres end up being anybody who's Mexican, right? And so the category ends up just kind of encapsulating everything and kind of like swallowing everything. I think if you wanted to keep a similar structure to, I'm getting very lawyerly, I think here. But I think if you wanted to keep the current structure of the immigration system and make it more fair or maybe less harmful, I think pouring $80 billion into it would do that. But I think that it would also create other issues that are perhaps equally ugly as what we're seeing now.
Like what?
There's always going to be an enforcement issue. And I think that if you start enforcing a lot of the laws that control people's access to space and who gets to be where, it gets ugly really quickly. And we've seen that historically. Refugees are frequently the initial targets and subjects of genocides. And I think that we're seeing very similar issues in the US as are popping up in Europe. And they have different, albeit similar immigration schemes. But the kind of like outsourcing of of unwanted individuals who often are from the global south and are fleeing really horrific stuff. The outsourcing to as profit to other countries is difficult to it's difficult to not fall into that in some ways, unless you kind of re-envision the way that you're thinking about some of these issues.
Finally, at sort of the law, practicing immigration law level, what obviously we just spoke about how some of this is being adjudicated on maybe you could say the outside, if you will, but what are some of the biggest challenges right now? Is it still the same stuff that we've been speaking about of making sure people have their attorneys? Maybe like what are you seeing right now when it comes to that?
Um, I think the lack of predictability has been very difficult. It's really impossible to give clients any sort of uh, assurance because it's not just discretionary. It's not just kind of random in some ways who gets targeted and who gets picked up. And because so many people now fall into these detention categories according to ICE, um, it can be lots of different people who weren't previously at risk. And so that has been very difficult. In addition to, I think the increase in detention is itself a increasing issue because it means that um, clients get detained. All of a sudden, that means that you're going to have to file a federal lawsuit of habeas. Those have been skyrocketing across the country. The good news on those is that um, federal judges, regardless of whether they're appointed by Reagan or Clinton or Obama or Bush or Trump, many judges have been granting habeas petitions to help people at least get a hearing about whether they can be detained, if not outright release. And I think that that has been positive, but it means that it's an additional step, an additional hurdle that is placed on people simply to get out of detention that they shouldn't have been in the first place.
And I've seen other reports too of people not being able to find their loved ones, or that individual while inside doesn't have the means after maybe they make a call and they don't get a hold of it or whatever. They don't have, and then I've also seen stories about that where it's almost impossible to communicate and find someone, right?
Yeah, and that's a longstanding issue. The ICE locator database is not always accurate, and it's been increasingly inaccurate. People are listed in the wrong place. They're not entered in the system at all. They're taking a really long time to enter in the process into the system. And so uh, that has been an ongoing issue. The other problem with how difficult it is to locate people is people get transferred very quickly, and everything inside a lot of these facilities is for pay. So if you don't have money, it's much more difficult to access things if you can't get any money into your commissary account, which you can't do if somebody doesn't know to put money in there. And so it can be very difficult.
Lauren, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take care.